So as David mentioned, I spend a lot of time with boards of directors of nonprofit organizations, of for-profit organizations, and this talk is really intended for them as a call to action for them, especially those who serve on the boards of the big technology companies, to join us in this fight to make technology more ethical and more humane. So, like many of you, I've actually been really heartened by a lot of the efforts by employees at a lot of these companies who are standing up, using their voice, overcoming their W-2 bias, and advocating for change from within. But too often, those efforts hit a brick wall with the leadership of these organizations. So employees whose motivations tend toward high quality products that do good in the world, those motives don't always align with leadership's orientation around earnings growth, around business model preservation, around cost containment, and a rising stock price. So those higher-ups can effectively ignore, underfund, undermine, or overrule good faith contributions that are brought forward by employees who are trying to resolve some of these ethical tensions that we're talking about today, because especially in instances where they don't align with the broader performance goals. But there is a group within these organizations that the management team must listen to, and it's their board. So the management team is directly accountable to their board in ways that they aren't accountable to us, the public, or to their employees, or to their customers. And I'd like to see boards use their power to hold management more accountable for creating ethical structures and ethical cultures. So here are a few recommendations for those that have drunk the Kool-Aid and are ready to advocate with us from within these organizations. So number one, I'd ask them at the most basic level to think beyond their fiduciary duty. So in the world of board governance, this term, fiduciary duty, is a phrase that you hear a lot. It effectively means that the board member's principal obligation or duty is to the company and its shareholders. And that duty usually gets fairly narrowly interpreted as working to advance the company's strategic and financial objectives in service to enriching its stockholders, and overseeing management in sort of the thinnest, most compliance-oriented of ways, like making sure that they're not stealing from the company, they're not self-dealing, they're not falsifying company results, et cetera. So now think of the fact that 2.3 billion people are accessing Facebook monthly, which represents 30% of the world's population, and that over 2/3 of Americans get their news on social media. You know, these are just raw facts. And so if you sit on the board, my argument is, if you sit on the board of one of these social media companies, you aren't merely a steward of just any for-profit enterprise. You are a steward of what's effectively a public utility. And what that means is that that power and that ubiquity creates a moral duty on top of and beyond the fiduciary one. And so the first thing that I'm asking is for board directors to really acknowledge and internalize that moral accountability. Number two, when you have a product that has been credibly and repeatedly accused of putting the safety of individuals, vulnerable populations, and democracy at risk worldwide, that is probably a sign that you need higher guardrails and better standards of care. So I recently read an article, it might be a month or two old, in the New York Times about Cloudflare's CEO, Matt Prince, talking about his decision ultimately to ban 8chan from their platform, from their security services. And he said that it was such a difficult decision because he had long held that web infrastructure services should really just simply not be in a position of policing content. And that's a value that I, appreciate and understand. But ultimately that position was trumped by the realization that 8chan was an enabler of hate, of violence, incitement, as evidenced by the multiple mass murders that authorities had connected to the site. And so he said, and I quote, "If we see a bad thing in the world and we can help get in front of it, we have some obligation to do that." That's an example of a bright line. A bright line is what says this is a moral boundary that we will hold even over other things that we value, like content agnosticism, and then of course, growth and profit. Number 3, demand ethics KPIs. So ahead of every board meeting, management teams send out a packet of materials on the company's performance, financial statements, operational metrics, assessments of risks, regulatory updates, and so on. What I'd like to see is more board members require that management provide an ethics KPI dashboard as part of those materials to keep ethics priorities on level with the financial and operating priorities that are the things that usually have management's and board's attention. And the key to that is that these metrics have to be outcomes and not outputs. Outcomes meaning incidents of user abuse, privacy breaches, third-party warnings, as opposed to outputs. Things like we wrote a code of ethics, we did a certain number of employee ethics trainings, and things that are quite easily manipulated by management and simply become ethics theater. 4, establish a board ethics committee. Boards should stand up ethics committees alongside all the other standard subcommittees, audit, compensation committees, governance, et cetera, whose mandate it is to scrutinize, advise, and oversee decisions that impact the public interest. Those should be chaired by actual ethicists, not just lawyers. I don't mean to offend any lawyers in the room, but I'm sick of seeing lawyers masquerading as ethicists inside organizations. So actual ethicists to advise management in the same way that board members with financial, legal, and strategic expertise do. Number 5, stress test corporate strategies. So what do I mean by that? So a board actually has the power of approving or vetoing management's corporate strategies. So that gives a board a unique opportunity to evaluate the strategic priorities and business models against those bright lines that we talked about a couple of slides ago to ensure that those strategies meet a certain ethical standard. It's an opportunity that they should use to push management and staff to innovate new strategies, new decisions, new choices, new products that don't compromise the public interest and still achieve those other business goals. Number 6, engage with employees and users. So often the people that boards tend to hear from are very curated by management. They're who management decides they can talk to and that get brought into the boardroom to, make very carefully crafted presentations. I think a better model is to let board members seek out unfiltered interactions with employees and users, especially those who've been negatively impacted by the company's products, so that when the time comes to endorse a particular strategy or initiative, there is a real-world human context, or as someone said in one of the earlier panels, that they have met someone at the end of the tech spear, looked them in the eye, and heard them say, "This is what you are doing that is harming me." That's the kind of context and grounding that people at the top of these organizations really need in order to make these decisions. And last, be willing to make waves. So for many board directors, agitating for reforms like these may feel like they are overstepping their oversight role and kind of encroaching on management. And that's part of just board culture, and also because many board directors are themselves C-suite executives at large corporations. But I think the board directors have to realize that those sort of norms, those very, bespoke norms, actually matter very little in the context of what's really at stake. We are in a race to build a culture of ethics within the world's largest technology companies so that healthy democracy, healthy communities, healthy human safety, decency, human dignity triumph over greed, toxicity, and lawlessness. And board members, I think, have a choice to be sort of barriers and defenders of the status quo, or they can be catalysts for change, like all of you in this room. And I hope they choose the latter. Thank you very much.